All right, hello everyone. Welcome back to the webinar series Embracing Change. This is pre-recorded, unlike all the other ones we've done. So today is our first, and we have Steve Legler all the way from Montreal, Canada. Thank you, Steve, for being with us. And I know it's early morning for you and evening for me. So I've had my dinner. I don't know if you've had your breakfast, but let's have some fun. So first, thank you, and then I'll introduce you. Thank you, Steve. Thank you very much for taking the time.
Thank you for having me, Feisal.
So
I've got
Steve
my
is
coffee. I had my breakfast. I'm on to my coffee now.
all right. Sounds good. So you're ready and fully charged. So
Oh, yeah.
Steve is a second generation family business member. He joined the business, and shortly thereafter there was a sale. Right? You exited the business, and then a family office was created, of which Steve was either designated or volunteered to take care of, manage, whatever the word is. And your dad went and started to choose to do something different and, and enjoy life, quote unquote. And from there, life took a few turns. And today you are the founder of Family Legacy Guide and one of the family advisors to various families in Canada and North America, if I understand correctly. And so today, Steve, it's okay with you, we're going to talk about the transition of wealth and maybe, what does that mean, to begin with, right? And what are the different options that you've seen as you've been there to advise families with that topic of what do I leave? Something, nothing? And if so, how much? And how do I do that? I know it's easier said than done. So Steve, what does transitional wealth mean to begin with?
First off, I want to say thank you for using the word transition. Too many people use the word transfer. And to me, like if you say, oh, you got to transfer me some money, I do a few clicks here and there and boom, I've transferred it. And like tomorrow morning, it's in your bank account. It's more of an instantaneous transaction. And too many people, I think, too many families and their advisors think of this subject as, well, today, mom and dad own the wealth. And then at some point, probably after a funeral, then the next generation will own the wealth and we'll go from 0 to 0 and 100. And I think that's the worst way to think about it. And I think transition is a much better word because it has a connotation of a more gradual, of a more process, of a longer period of time, which is what I always try to advise my family clients is don't try to do this quick. Take your time with it. And if you can have, let's just ignore the financial part, but let's talk about the leadership and the management of the business or the family office. If you can have the younger generation start to assume a role and the older generation start to let go some of those responsibilities, and then gradually over months and years and perhaps even decades, that flips from this way to that way as opposed to the transfer, then that's usually better because it allows you to learn from each other, learn to cohabitate, learn to manage at the same time, gradually adjust and do all your little trial and error on every monthly basis of how this is going and adjust so that when you look at this later in the rearview mirror, you can see that, okay, in that year, mom and dad started to let go of this responsibility and Junior and Susie came along and started to do this. And then eventually those things cross just like they do in our lives, right? When you were born, your mother changed your diaper. At some point, your mother might need diapers and you will probably be paying someone to take care of hers. So, but that doesn't happen. You don't flip from one up to one down overnight. So why should the transition of the wealth be any different? This should be a gradual thing. And so whatever you can do to make it more slowly but surely, let's get there, as opposed to, okay, Friday, I'm leaving the office on Friday. I quit. I'm never coming back. Monday, you come in and you're the boss and nobody even knows who you are, but let's just start with you. It doesn't make any sense.
So what I'm hearing is slow and steady wins the race. It's gradual. It's transition connotating, one day at a time. But at the same time, it is still a transition of actually doing that. Now, again, some are choosing not to give, some are choosing to partially give, and some are choosing to give it all, right? So what are you seeing and what seems to be working? And I know, and people say, well, it depends on the DNA of the family and all of that, but let's get maybe with examples, right, of what.
Well, you forgot one actually, and this is one where the younger generation actually buys the business.
Okay.
And
yeah.
That makes sense when there's an operating business. If it's past the point where there's an operating business and it's family wealth, it's harder to have somebody buy a portfolio so that their siblings don't have it. But when there's an operating business, and I remember when I was working for my father, it was like I didn't want to buy this business. I wanted to get it for nothing. And I never realized until much later that there's a lot of good reasons why that does make sense, especially in situations where there are several offspring. And I use the word offspring rather than children, because children is fine when their age is in single digits or in the teens, but once they hit 20 something, I don't like to call people children, because then that moniker usually sticks. And then they become the children when they're in their 50s and 60s, and you're dealing with parents in the 70s and 80s, and they're talking about the kids. But the kids have their own kids and maybe even their own grandkids. So let's stop calling them kids. Yeah. So when you have several offspring and not all of them are going to work in the business, there are a lot of reasons why it makes sense to have those who will be running the business to buy the business from their parents. Now, they're not going to buy it typically at the same 100%, 100 cents on the dollar that if the parents sold it to an external buyer, right? If your business is worth $10 million that you could sell it, and now your son comes to buy it, you're probably not saying, well, give me the $10 million. There's usually some kind of family discount involved, but there needs to be, or there should be, some sort of skin in the game where these particular offspring among all of them are making this choice and putting something down to say, I want this, I'm investing in this, I'm going to take care of this, as opposed to the one who never had anything to do with the business. They'd walk in the front door, no one would even know they were related to the owners. Those people don't have the same blood, sweat, and tears claim on the business. And so there are reasons for treating your offspring differently, and there always are, and there always will be. Now, you still want to treat them equitably, but that doesn't equal, and fair is not the same thing.
Okay.
So there are ways. So that was a little sidebar about the part about
the fourth option.
Now, the leaving everything is typically, I think, the way most people are planning it. I know we hear stories about these billionaires with the giving pledge, and they say they're going to give away half their money to charity, and all that's great. And you hear about people like Bill Gates say, I'm only going to leave my kids $1 million, and all the rest is going to go to charity. And for them, that's a nominal amount, the $1 million. For a lot of people, it would be a lot. And for Donald Trump, who keeps saying he got a small loan from his parents, but I don't want to talk about him anymore. He's hopefully yesterday's news. But no, I think what you're getting at is that I look at this more from the parents' point of view. And what are your offspring capable of handling? And are they ready to be stewards of everything that you've created? Because that's what often happens is, usually with the creator generation, sometimes with the next generation who has grown it even bigger, they end up with a lot of financial wealth that entails a lot of responsibility and stewardship. And then they worry that the offspring that they've raised may or may not be well prepared and ready and want to now continue taking care of all that wealth that they will be inheriting. And so they often try, and with with good intention and getting advised by people who are well paid and well trained to do this, to say, oh, well, you can't just leave all that money to your kids, they're going to blow it. So you need to create this kind of a trust, or you need to create this so that they don't screw it up, right? You have these parents who are saying, I don't want all this wealth to screw up my kids, and I don't want my kids to screw up all the wealth. And so they look for solutions, and they go to their lawyers and their trust people, and they all say, oh, well, I have a hammer, so everything I see looks like a nail, and I know how to take care of these issues. And we create these legal structures so that your kids can't blow the money. Okay, fine. Parents see that and say, well, okay, this is what they're telling me. And then, of course, that advisor says, and you know, Bob Jones, who owns the big company there, and the other guy across town, you know, that, well, I did the same thing for them. And if it was good enough for them, it should be good enough for you. So the parents who don't really know what they should be doing or could be doing, they follow the advice of these experts, and they go and they do what people, this is best practice, this is what people do. And I think that that's kind of backwards in many ways. And that too much work is done to prepare the assets for the offspring, and not enough work is done to prepare the offspring to receive the assets. Okay. And that's where I like to focus my attention, is on what are you doing with your offspring to help prepare them to assume the roles that you know that they could very well be playing someday. And if you have this many assets and your offspring are prepared to receive this many assets, you've got an issue. And if you could prepare your offspring to receive whatever, you're in a much better place. So too many times I've seen this where parents are so focused on working in the business and making the pie as big as possible, they don't get to the point of their life where the switch flips and they say, okay, wait a sec, this pie is big enough. I really got to figure out, how am I going to transition this pie to the people coming behind me? And I should switch my focus and my efforts to making sure that that is taken care of, rather than saying, well, you know, if I'm going to leave them $100 million, they can't possibly blow that in their lifetime. So maybe I'll work to make it 150 or 200. Well, it's not the amount, it's not the number of zeros after the dollar sign that makes a difference. It's how well prepared the people are to follow up. Do they want to? Are they able? Do they care? And that's the part that gets neglected. And these people come to their lawyer and they say, oh, you know, and they lament one of their children, and they're referring to them as children because they're less capable and they're certainly one down. Oh, you know, my son just did this again or whatever. And so they are preparing those experts to even go further into making restrictive structures for them. And that sort of compounds it. And I know this kind of message doesn't resonate with all families, but for the ones for whom they're actually looking for this, because it is that they do trust the ones that they gave birth to, that they are now raising, I think more people should be looking at the human side of the wealth transition as opposed to just the financial.
Yeah. All right, so let's get tangible, Steve. So why don't you help us share 3 to 5 things that you help families begin to do or mandate to do, right, politely, that helps them prepare from the human side, right, to manage and be prepared to protect, manage, and maybe grow the wealth?
Well, the simplest, and when I say simple, please note that simple and easy are not synonyms. And so when I say it's simple, that doesn't mean it's easy to do. However, if you asked me for one thing that families who have done this well have instituted as a regular thing that they do that others who are not successful have not. It's having regular family meetings. And when I say regular family meetings, I mean meetings of the family where the main point of discussion is the family and the well-being of the family, and where that family and the humans who are part of that family and their own individuation and maturity and finding their own path, where those are the subjects, the people, and how the family's wealth or business impacts the family. And so you have a lot of, often some of the people work in the business and they'll be tempted to talk mostly about the business. And it is important for the ones in the business to share with the ones who are not in the business so that they understand or are a little bit more current with what's going on in the business, because often there's this information asymmetry problem where you have the ones in the business know everything, and then they come to the family dinner and they're talking about the business and everyone else is going, all they talk about is you need to have at least occasionally, hopefully quarterly at least, a meeting where the family gets together and talks about family stuff and checks in on each other as family, where they also talk about the relationship of the business. Is the business doing well? Is the business not doing well? Is there anything the family can do to support the business when it's not doing well? Do we have to expect less dividends? Can we go in and help in some way? That there needs to be a forum, a regular forum whereby the family comes together and allows this discussion to take place. Now, at first, it kind of feels awkward. Why are we doing this? And some of the quieter members of the family, especially if they're not involved in the business, they might feel uncomfortable and saying, why are we doing this? After, mark my words, after 3 or 4 meetings, once they realize now this is a regular forum where I can come and I'm being asked to participate, they will start to have more questions. They will start feeling more comfortable offering their input, and they will know that if a month after a meeting something happens, they'll know, oh, well, at the next meeting will be my opportunity to bring this up in the right place and time to talk about these subjects. And those subjects are always there. It's just that if I'm the outsider and I know my brother's running the business or my sister's running the business with my dad and my uncle, I feel like it's not my place. But if you give me a time and a place, and every once in a while you ask me, so what do you think? Do you understand? Do you have any questions? Do you have any concerns? Eventually, you get to hear all the voices and you can look at things as a family. And I think the family is more important than the business. There's a family business and there's the business family. I like to concentrate more on the business family because I think too many people spend too much time focusing on the family business.
Okay, and is this facilitated or is this done as a family on its own, or does it begin facilitated and then transition? Like what are you
I
seeing?
think I think the ideal one is it begins facilitated and then they run it on their own. One of my favorite clients I had was one where I started working just with the rising generation. I hadn't even met the patriarch until about 6 months in. They just hired me to work with them to help them learn to work together. There was not a very clear mandate, but it was fine. These are the kind I like. It's let's figure it out as we go along. Let's co-create it. And after a couple of years, we had created a family council whereby the 4 offspring were running the meetings. They were inviting their parents to come to the meetings. They were alternating who was the chair of the meeting between themselves. So we had one of them was the chair and one of their siblings was the secretary. And then 3 months later, the one who was the secretary would come and chair the meeting and the next one would be the secretary. We'd rotate through and the parents would show up at the meetings and here would be the agenda and here would be their offspring running the meetings. And you should have seen the smiles on their faces because this is exactly what they wanted. They wanted to know, like most families do, that the elder generation, they're picturing someday we're not going to be here. And these other people are going to be running this. Will they be able to do it? Will they be able to work together without fighting and lead and share this responsibility? And if you can get to the point where the parents are still in their 60s and now their offspring who are in their 30s are already assuming this role, now you know you've got something. Now, it takes a while to get there. I can tell you about a man who had a family meeting for his business family in 1985. I was there. I was the son. My dad called a family meeting because he had heard from consultants, people like me now, saying you need to have a family meeting. But he wasn't the kind of guy who was going to hire someone to come and run his family meeting. He was the patriarch. He was going to run his own damn family meeting. And so we went up north for a weekend, and I don't remember much except that my father did 98% of the talking and downloaded a bunch of information of his thoughts to us. There was no sharing, there was no asking, there was nothing. And we did not have another family meeting until 2006. Now, 21 years between family meetings is not the ideal interval. Like I was saying, it should be quarterly, maybe semi-annually. And the 21 years was only because of his cancer diagnosis. And so now all of a sudden, oh, I better have a family meeting because now maybe my days are numbered. He lasted another 2 years, but we had another family meeting. Now, what went wrong in that first family meeting? First of all, like I just said, he was just downloading. There was no exchange. There was no dialogue. We left the meeting without having scheduled the next meeting. That's my little secret. I know every time I go to the dentist, before I leave, they give me my next appointment because otherwise I'm going to conveniently forget to make another appointment, right? Yeah. My chiropractor does the same thing. When are you coming back? So it should be the same thing for a family meeting. Hey, we're all here. Pull out your agendas. We're going to do this. So now it's late February, so we should be looking at May. Everyone, how's that second week of May looking? Can we do it on, do that, put it on the calendar, make sure people know that there will be another one. This is not a one-off. I was sharing this with someone the other day. It's not that, when I was a kid, I went fishing with my grandfather once. It's my grandfather used to take me fishing. I don't remember very many particular fishing trips. I remember doing this. It was a habitual, it was a repeating thing. Now that was not on a regular schedule, but you can do this with family meetings. And when everyone knows that there is a time and a place to come together to discuss these things, then they don't fester. Or, when there's a conflict and you bury it, it doesn't go away. It gets worse over time. Yeah. So that little conflict that happened in 2012, if you dealt with it in 2013, it's better than if you waited till 2022, because who knows what the stories the people are telling themselves over the 10 years. You need to have a time and a place to clear the air, and things happen. And actually, the best example of this was when the pandemic hit. I can't believe it's almost 2 years ago. But I remember somebody saying that the pandemic was a fantastic test of family governance for a lot of family businesses. And what that means is the pandemic hits, so now all of a sudden business as usual is no longer business as usual, and companies have to make decisions. Yeah. So companies, family business, where they already have some governance, the crap hits the fan. They have a little meeting and say, well, we got to do this. What are we going to do? Like, are we going to keep paying employees? Are we going to shut down? How are we going to do all this? Yeah. They would do that and they'd go on. Other companies where they didn't have much family governance, one person made a decision and said, oh, we're going to do this, and I think we should do that. And then in the following weeks and months, the siblings or the other family members will say, hey, who said you were allowed to do this? Or you made this decision. I never would have gone along with that. Right? So when things are going normal, it's fine. But when stuff pops up like a pandemic, it's good to be able to know that you have a place to come to, and you have business partners, even if they're not in the business, but they're owners or they're future owners of the business, they're part of the family. When big decisions are being made, they like to be aware or consulted or part of it. And so So those families who did have a place to come to, where they knew how to get together and everyone was sort of current with what's going on and could actually add value with their ideas, those businesses did a lot better. The ones where one person made a decision because of whatever, and the rest of the family was like, wait, I wouldn't have done that. Why didn't we do this? Or why didn't you ask me? Or who gave you the authority to make that decision? These can become flashpoints later on. So having a place for the family to come together regularly to talk about things is the single biggest difference between the families that do well versus the ones that don't.
Okay, so what I'm hearing is having that process, but very importantly, having consistency, right, and persistency, and also with the option, like when there's an emergency, like, you know, like the pandemic, that everybody is used to being called in to participate in major decision making, so that we're aligned and that there's no surprises or any misunderstandings or blame, right, afterwards, right? That's what I'm hearing. Okay, so that's the first piece. And then in most cases, begin with facilitation, unlike 1985, and so that there is a actual check-in, so that there is a safe space to begin the conversation. There's acknowledgement, people are heard, people are seen, people are celebrated, right? And there's a balance between the family and the business side, so that it doesn't feel like an imbalance for those participating or not participating. And it could be a family office where it's a balance between the wealth and the management of the wealth vis-a-vis the actual family members and their well-being. And you're speaking to, you know, the converted. We our whole life is about health and well-being and family dynamics. So, okay, so that's the first step. What would be the next item on the agenda
if you ask me what is the biggest challenge that many of the families that I work with are facing, it's that there are a lot of now gen, as opposed to next gen, current generation leaders who feel like they are the best person to run the business now and forever, and they don't, and they don't have something else to go towards, and so they want to stick around longer. And maybe subconsciously they are not allowing those coming behind them to flourish because they want to justify the fact that they want to stay there. Those are the toughest ones, where you have you know, you look at Queen Elizabeth, who just doesn't want to get off that escalator. And as the escalator gets to the top, it feels like she's taking a step backwards. And meanwhile, here comes the one behind. And eventually, you know, it's what I call sticky baton syndrome. Like they're supposed to hand it off, but it's stuck to their hand. And that's a real tough one, because the younger ones coming behind, you don't want to be pushing them, because that will make them resist more. It's almost, you need to find ways for, rather than pushing, for them to be pulled towards something.
And how old are, sorry, go ahead.
Often the spouse, if there is one in the picture, can be useful in that, but in helping them identify different places where their current skill set and all their experience could benefit others. And at the same time, you need to be able to demonstrate that those coming behind are actually ready to take on.
I think, so the question is that it's about identity, right? That who am I is the question, right? It's a death and a rebirth, right?
Yes.
And we work with a lot of you know, CEOs that become chairman, or a lot of, you know, like we said, active become advisory, or people who, like your father, sold their company and then, you know, they're transitioning to family office. You know, there's basically who I am and who becomes who I was. And if their identity is attached to that role, it's actually a death and a rebirth, right? And that's a whole process that you're referring to, is that how can you help facilitate that transition? Now, so how old is the now generation you're referring to? Just out of curiosity?
Well, it varies, but I mean, when I think that if they haven't started to plan where they're going, when their age flips to start with a 6, they're probably too late. And if it starts with a 7 and they're still not starting to phase out, there's a problem too.
Okay, so that means the next gen, we'll call them next gen,
Yep.
is already in their late 30s, 40s, and even in some cases 50s.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So that's where you see the more challenging experience. Now, what about, are they at least teaching them how to manage the money, or they're not even teaching them how to manage the company?
They're all different, but I mean, the worst ones are the ones that think that they know best and nobody can ever do this as well as me.
Yeah.
And I always scratch my head when I see those people, and when I get to talk to them, I ask them a lot of questions about, wouldn't it be better for you to leave knowing that the people behind you are well prepared? Because it almost feels like they would prefer that after they leave, everything falls apart so they could say, see, I was the only one who could do it. I don't understand that mentality.
Yeah.
It probably comes from some scarcity mentality when they were growing up, or needing to prove themselves. There's a lot of work that can be done with people like that. It doesn't always succeed, but I prefer not to talk about those negative situations. There are a lot of people, but as you say, it's their identity. You need to help them work to the point where they can see a bigger and better and a different identity for themselves.
It's a new purpose, right?
And a new purpose, and a way that they can have something that they wake up in the morning and look forward to doing.
Yeah, because the people we've seen that don't have that, and they are forced, or they do it out of obligation, or because they've been advised, sorry, Steve, to do so, and are not prepared for the next stage, many a times dwindle, right? And when I say dwindle, I mean physically, mentally, emotionally, in all realms, right? So, but I hear you now with longevity, right? There are cases where there's 3 generations in the business, right? And so the frustration of the 3rd gen, and I mean 3rd, I just mean in number, right?
Yep.
It could be 6th, but just 3rd, watching that their parents or their mother or father didn't have the baton, the sticky baton handed, right? They're just showing up.
Well, you know what? In theory, what you're saying is a bigger problem, right? When you see now there's the escalator is really getting backed up. In practice, I've heard anecdotally that it's actually not as bad, because grandpa, it's usually grandpa, not grandma, maybe going forward it'll be more grandma more often, but might feel a lot more affinity towards a grandchild and training them and explaining things, because that grandchild never had to get grounded, or never, there's that extra generation in between where some of that transition and training and mentoring feels more natural. Now, that sometimes leaves that middle generation getting squeezed out. And sometimes that does happen. Sometimes that second generation person, when they get to 55 and they see, dad's still in his late 70s and still coming to work, and he's still putting in 60 hours a week, and I don't want to work 60 hours a week when I'm his age. So I just sort of rather skip my turn and pass it to my son.
That's amazing. Okay.
So when that can happen, I mean, it doesn't happen that often, but I've heard stories like this, and I get why there's it's a simpler way. But what all these require is that somebody actually takes a personal inventory and says, what am I doing? What do I want to do? How long do I want to keep doing this? And can I remove myself from this so that others can flourish more? And so maybe it's not the G1 at the top. They cannot do that. Maybe the G2 has to say, you know what, I'll step aside so that someone behind me can come in.
So I think what we've done right now is talk about transition of wealth that includes the business. So I think let's just be clear, it's not just the wealth as in dollars and cents and bonds and real estate, but the wealth overall. Now, what about the money side, like the actual liquid assets? Like, what are you seeing in practice that is working from the liquid asset side, or even maybe real estate, which may be classified as illiquid, but it's still an investment. So the non-operating business, how do you prepare them?
You're talking about a subject that in the field that I'm in, that we're in, there's not a linear curve of what it is, but it basically, it starts with family business, typically on the smaller end, from the mom and pop shop to like the billion-dollar families that are financial families or legacy families or dynasty families, where a very small portion of the wealth is in an operating business that they're dealing with. And so a lot of people like me, I started from a family business view. Now I'm kind of graduating towards more of the wealthy families where it's more financial. And it's interesting what you can learn from one that applies to the other. And I think I always say that the family business ones are more, there's more meat on the bones. They're different in very different ways, because different family members are playing different roles. Where you get to the other extreme, it's a lot more homogeneous once you get out of the operating part, and more of, they might still control a major family business, but nobody in the family actually works there, right? They're owners, they're board members. And so those families, it's a little more homogeneous, so there's a little more you can learn from what other families have done.
Okay.
They usually have no shortage of really well-paid advisors who take care of all the structural parts. Again, where things fall apart sometimes is more on the human side, right? And making sure that you have done things for your family as opposed to the wealth. So if you look at the three-circle model, you have the business. If you substitute the business for the dollar sign, you still have the family and the ownership circles. You want to be not neglecting the family circle. And in fact, you theoretically have more resources available to help that family circle, to help them with health, to help them with mental health, to help them with learning and flourishing and creating a career that isn't dependent upon the family, but that can be supported by the resources that the family has, whether that's going away to a good school, whether that's helping them start some entrepreneurial business, whether that's helping to support some cause and do it in a philanthropic way or in some kind of impacted investing. There are ways that I don't think are being exploited as much as they could in some of these wealthy families, to take the financial resources of the family and invest them in the human capital of the family members. I think there's some low-hanging fruit out there in some families that I think the industry is going more towards that. And a lot of talk about a chief learning officer and having families involved in personal projects for each family member to be able to fulfill and do what drives them, as opposed to being held as, okay, here's your trust fund and you're going to get this quarterly distribution and try not to blow it all. And, and if you have to go to rehab, we'll find you a good rehab place, and just don't bother us. We're busy managing these billions of dollars. It's more of putting the onus on, let's make sure all of these family members are supported to be able to become the best selves that they can be.
Yeah. Okay, so you're talking about self-actualization. You're speaking to what Philip, Iraj, and Kenneth talk about in terms of the circular economy. How do we leverage, all the family members and their contribution, their capacities and capabilities to be able to, do it differently. But what I'm hearing in the undercurrent you spoke to, and I want clarification, is that you feel that the circle of the family, when there's a family business, versus the circle of the family when there's a dollar sign, which is a family office of sorts, there is less emphasis on the human capital. Is that what I'm hearing? Or is it?
I don't know if it's less, and it's hard to generalize. Let me turn it around a bit. I think that when it's just a dollar sign as opposed to an operating business, it's theoretically simpler to actually access those resources and put them to work for the family members.
Yeah.
And so the missed opportunity when they don't do that is more noticeable to someone like me. When I see a family that everyone in town knows this is like the wealthiest family in town, and you hear stories about their teenage kids or their young adults, and they're doing things that it's like, wow, there was some parenting that could have turned this around and made it very different and more of a positive of this family has wealth and they are using it for good, for the good of all the people in the family, which will then in turn become for the good of the community and the neighborhood and society in general. And that's where I think that the younger people these days have a much more open attitude towards, you know, what's good for the planet and long term. So I have a lot of hope when I see young people today. I'm almost always impressed and say, wow. And I think of myself back when I was that age, and there's no way that I was that like enlightened
that
as
conscious,
to what's going on.
conscious.
And so I have a lot of, and so when I see young people who are part of these families and I see the potential, I get excited about it. And when I see young people and they're kind of dithering and they're not sure, and they happen to be from a family like that, I'm like, okay, wait, there's a missed opportunity here. How can we, who in the family office or somewhere, who can get this family to realize that, hey, there's some human capital there that we may not be doing as much as we should to support. And hopefully it's not too late, because a lot of things get formed when people are young. And if you wait too long, sometimes it's a lot harder to turn people around.
All right. So going back to you said the first piece on family meetings. I mean, at what age are the next gen or third gen showing up in these meetings? At what age?
As soon as they are, I would say, I've heard people use different ages, 16, 14, and sometimes you can have a 12-year-old who's more mature than their 18-year-old cousin, right? So it's hard to put an age. But if you asked me, give me an age, I'd say 14, as long as they can behave, and you don't have to have them for every meeting for the whole meeting, but to start to let them know that, hey, this family has meetings, and here are some of the things we talk about, and we're not going to hide them from you. So please come to the meeting so you don't think that we're talking about you or hiding things from you. And if you have an older brother or an older sister who's 14 and going to the meetings and you're 12, you start to figure out, hey, in a couple of years, I'll be there. And it just becomes a natural thing. So much of this is all about just making things a regular thing, right? It's not about having that one conversation or that one meeting. It's those 100 one-minute conversations that take place over weeks and months that you need to. People always ask me, oh, how do you get your kids to learn about business? I just put on a TV show like Shark Tank or Dragon's Den or whatever, and sit there and watch with your kids and say, here, this person has this idea and they're asking for so much money for this percentage of their business, pause the TV. I used to do this. My kids were like 10 and 12, and then somebody'd say, I want $100,000 for 10% of my company. And I would pause the TV and say, so they think their business is worth how much? $1 million. Wow, they think their business is worth $1 million. Okay, let's watch and see if it feels like it's worth $1 million. You're driving down the street, you see a billboard for McDonald's and something, whatever. You talk about, oh, wow, look, they have this Happy Meal and they're charging this much. I wonder, what would that cost if you bought those things individually? Oh, well, there's always chances to talk about money and business and life with your kids. And now I'm using the word children because I'm talking about them when they are still small, and to get them to understand about how the world works, that this is normal, that people talk about this stuff. And especially if you are from a family where there is a lot of financial wealth, I know it's not, you don't want to talk about we're the richest family in town and look at all the money. No, I'm not saying to do that, but to make talking about money something that you can talk about as a family, and it's not taboo. It's not like, talking about sex. People say, oh, when do you have that talk with your kids and talk about the birds and the bees? I always say, you know what, the families that are on a farm, they don't have to have that discussion because they've seen the horses or the sheep or the cows, and they've seen them doing it. And it's like, okay, well, that's what they're doing. So it's just becomes a matter of fact.
But what about the sharing of the actual figures, right? If they're going to the family meeting at 14, is there some kind of censorship that is happening in terms of the numbers? Because revenue is one thing, bottom line is one thing, net worth is one thing, right? So is there anything of that nature that's happening, or is it, let's hope and pray that doesn't get to anybody's head?
No, usually that becomes a gradual thing. So people always talk about, when do I tell my kids how much money we have? And often this they're already into their 20s and 30s, and they already have a pretty good idea that you're flying around on a private jet or you have 3 vacation homes. They already know that you have more than everybody else in town. So it's not a huge secret, and it's very easy to Google somebody's name and put net worth and get some kind of numbers. They're probably wrong, but they're probably in the right ballpark. This is where I like to talk about the dimmer switch instead of the light switch. So people who have a lot of wealth and they keep it secret from their kids, and they wonder, when is the day where I'm going to now take them from the dark to fully in the light? And that's, again, I like gradual, right? So you don't make them drink from the fire hose, and you don't have them in the dark and put on all the floodlights and blind them. So you bring them along slowly, and you start to share general without the dollar signs, but you give them an idea, and you turn on the light, the dimmer switch a little bit, and you illuminate them. And then if you come back 3, 6, 12 months later and share a little bit more, now you've seen how they have reacted. Have they absorbed that well? Did they have a huge reaction? Did they, and then you share more and more as it's age appropriate. But yeah, so many people say, oh, I can't share that information, because they're thinking of it as a binary. Would I rather have them know 0 or everything? It's very easy to say 0 is simpler. Let them know nothing, because I'm not prepared for them to know everything. But you don't have to go from 0 to 100 in one meeting. And I don't think you should. And I think the smart families don't. Now, there are ways to do it, to talk in percentages or ballpark numbers, or you use a pro forma of a related business where you say, these are not our numbers, but other businesses like us run like this, and here are the kinds of margins, and here's the idea. And so if we could, increase this allows us to do that. We've invested so much in this new plant. Give them some ideas so that they can start to process the level of the numbers, as opposed to, oh my God, Mom and Dad, you made $5 million last year and you only give me $10 allowance.
Okay, so coming back to, the concept of how much do I give, and what I'm hearing from you in the beginning was that most people that you see transition most of the wealth or all of the wealth to the next gen, right? Now, when you see the exceptions, other than the ones that say I'm only going to give $1 or $2 or $10 and the rest I'm giving away, right? What are the things you see as minimums, right? Do you see people saying nowadays, because that's what I'm hearing is, okay, I want to at least secure a home, and that means an apartment or some kind of shelter. Others are saying, I want to secure medical insurance, right? Others are saying, because they're seeing that there's certain things that are becoming unaffordable, even though they don't want to, it's to give them enough, right, to do something, but not enough to do nothing, right? That's what Warren Buffett is saying.
I love that one. Yeah,
right.
I want them to have. Yeah, they can do anything they want, but they can't do nothing.
Yeah, and then the other one, what I'm hearing recently, obviously, is that the two things. wealth can be can buy you freedom. At the same time, it can be a curse. But it's only a curse if your next gen, or your offspring, as you put it, don't learn how to earn and don't learn how to suffer, right? These are two things that they need to be able to do, from which brings agility, adaptability, right? But there's still certain things that families want to give as a minimum. Do you see that?
A lot of people there's an acronym for it, and I forget what it's health. Anyway, there's a few categories that people say, well, I want them to have health, education, lifestyle. I forget what the acronym is, but there's, and I'm sure there are different ones out there. But of course, if the family says, I want to make sure I'm providing for this, this, and this, that makes a lot of sense. And they could do that for all of them equally, right? To say, we will fund this, and we make some rules. And hopefully you co-create it with them, as opposed to just downloading it to them, right? If you can say, this is what we want to do, what makes sense. I always say, if you can involve the people for whom you are making these decisions, if you can involve them at all, even if you don't, like, it's not you're asking them, tell me what, you're just involving them in a dialogue. So you are co-creating what this will look like with at least some of them, so that they have some buy-in. The chances of it standing up long-term are much better than, well, this is what dad decided and told his lawyer, and this is what went in the will, and now that he's dead, we have no choice but to live with it the way it is. And even though we don't like it, and then they fight it. So if you can get them involved in creating what it's going to look like, how can they do it? You'll often be surprised at how resourceful and how creative and how fair they are with each other. That sometimes the parents say, oh, we can't have that discussion with them because it'll cause a fight. I think that usually that's wrong, that if you just bring them and allow them to come to the table and frame the discussion appropriately, you'll actually get a lot from them and be pleasantly surprised at how mature and how good they are at sharing amongst each other. I know that's what I've seen.
So you're talking about co-creation, you're talking about involving them. You're basically talking about having them accountable for their own future by participating in that decision-making, so that there's no blame, right? There's no blame game after, because they were part of the process, right?
Well, it's all about having them be involved in everything. Have the family figure out what the family wants, what's good for the family. And then when you need to have that now put into documents and structures, then you go and see your lawyers and your accountants and say, this is what we want, write it up for us to make it stick and make it legal. But what happens too often is the parents go see the lawyers and the accountants, and they say, what should we do? Those lawyers and accountants, all they know is what they've done for other people, so they recycle somebody else's solution, and hopefully they remember to change all the names in all the pages that they're regurgitating for you. And then they say, here, this is what you should do. And then it tries to get retrofitted to that family, and then it doesn't work so well. But now you've already paid for it, it's already there, it's going to be good enough. And then the problems invariably come out later. And so I know why it happens that way. I wish it wouldn't happen that way so much. And I always try to say, when I meet a family that already has something, great, so let's see what you have. Now, does that really fit? Usually they realize right away there's already things that don't fit. And that's when I'll say, why don't we go, let's leave this aside. Let's figure out if we were starting with a blank slate, how would we create it? And then usually there's a way to say, okay, can we change what was already there to this new way that actually fits, because the family has been involved in putting together what makes sense. My dad always used to say, there's a difference between what to do and how to do it. And so let's figure out what to do. And then if we need experts to figure out how to do it, but let's for ourselves figure out what we want to do. And that's still usually a more solid way to do things, although it's still more often the exception than the rule, unfortunately.
All right, Steve, we've got about 5 minutes left, before we've almost almost to the hour. So is there something we didn't touch on, even whether it's the topic of the wealth, transition of wealth, or anything else that you'd like to share so that the people can reflect or think about, or we can debate, whatever feels that, you've like, that's
I'll
occurring.
go back to, but I'll revisit the part about how this should take a while. Too often families think, I want to get this over with. I want to be able to say it's done, right? I want to be able to, we're going to go and we're going to get the lawyers and the accountants to draw this up. We're going to sign it. And then we won't have to think about it again. That's not the best way to think about this. This is a constant, it's a transition, and things will evolve all the time. So if you go and you take that attitude, let's go and we'll sign this and we'll do it and it'll be done. I promise you that 5 years later, if you've done nothing in between, something or things will have changed. And what you did 5 years ago will no longer be the perfectly appropriate thing that you would do if you were doing it again. So do not treat this as a, okay, it's done and I forget it. Treat it as a, let's keep this alive and make sure that we're talking about it so that we can continue to tweak it, adjust it, change it, bring it up to date for what our family's needs are. Just like, when you write your will, you shouldn't wait too many years before you at least look at it again to see, oh, wow, wait a sec, I had so-and-so on there. They've been dead for a year. I better change that, right? And so people do that. So same thing with this, and even more important because there's more moving parts. And you want to be able to trial and error and be flexible and know, we set this up in this way because we thought it was going to work like this. Now, 2 years later, we realized that didn't work so well, but oh, wait, we had this other thing that we didn't think was going to turn into anything. And now it's turning great. So how do we rebalance? How do we readjust? There are ways. And when you have regular family meetings, you have a place where these things come up. Okay. And even if it's not the leading generation that's bringing them up, as the rising generation starts to take more place at the table, they hopefully will be the ones who bring this up, because eventually then it'll be, yeah, we really should modify this. And ideally then dad says, yeah, Junior, why don't you call Bob the lawyer and talk to him about changing this rather than making me do it, because you actually know what you want it to look like. So transitioning yourself out by keeping things alive, empowering the rising generation to be taking the appropriate bigger roles at the table, I think this is what you want to see. And again, it's easy to talk about. It's not always that easy to do, but once you get started. I always say, be in a hurry to get started, but don't be in a hurry to finish. So hurry up and get people to the table. And then once you're there, let that train go down the track as slow as it wants, as long as it's going down the track and making progress, and you have the right people on the train. You can move the people around into the different seats, but you're making progress. But you don't have to be in a hurry to get to a destination, because there is no destination. There's no destination. It's all journey. If people would adopt that mentality, that it's a journey and my journey will end, and there's other people behind me, their journey will keep going even after I've been kicked off the train. And if people could develop that attitude, I know it's hard because people don't want to picture that train going on after they've been kicked off. But if you look back on where that journey came from, there were people that were there that were older than you that are no longer on the train, and the train is still going. And so it's going to keep going after you're no longer there. So what can I do while I'm still here to make sure that the rest of the journey, even after I've disembarked, will go as well as possible for these other people who are on the train with me that I care about? And I don't know where that train analogy came from, but because I've never used it before. Okay. So I'm going to use it again.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing is a word that we didn't touch upon is custodianship, right? The acceptance that we are the custodians of this wealth, right? And we always talk about custodians of wealth, intelligence, right? That we have a much larger responsibility because of that custodianship. And I think that's what you're talking about, is that we're a custodian on this train as long as we're on the train. And when it's time to go, it's time to go. And then the next custodians and the train continues. So I think the word you're referring to is custodianship, which I think is something that we need to learn or can consider to accept, that it's not, we don't own it, we just hold it, right? And carry it until it's time to pass it on or transition it or.
Yeah, I like that word, custodianship. The one I hear, the synonym stewardship.
Yeah.
But the whole idea and the difference between the founder wealth creator is that they see it as my wealth that I'm going to bestow, right? Whereas once you get past that person and you then it becomes more of a stewardship, because they have received it, so they understand that there's an act of receiving and then there's an act of passing it on, and hopefully that will continue, right? So it's harder, and that sticky baton is more often with that wealth creator, that founder.
Okay.
But once you, and that's why it's like driving a standard car, right? Getting out of first gear is the hardest, but once you're into second and third, shifting gears is simple, but it's that first one that's the toughest. So when you get to the point where it's already transitioned, you know you're dealing with someone who was already at least understands that there is I'm just one link on the chain. And so it's often easier to deal with them, but not always, because as you go down one generation to the next, you also end up with more people. Right. And if you haven't pruned that tree to different branches, it can get unwieldy with the number of people. So then that becomes sometimes the biggest challenge, is you're dealing with cousins and second cousins, and now they don't know each other so well, but they're still supposed to act together, even though they barely know each other, but they're related and they're co-owners. So you have different challenges.
All right, Steve, thank you very much. Absolute pleasure, honor. Thank you again for waking up early in the morning to be with us today and sharing the wealth of wisdom as a second gen, as an advisor now to many families in North America, and to discuss this topic of the transition of wealth in a broader sense, right? And with the different nuggets that you shared. So once again, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me. It was fun. I hope people found something useful in our discussion.
Yeah, and thank you, everyone. Like I said, this is the first of a number coming. Next, we will have Tsitsi coming in next week, and he's going to talk about the Ubuntu transition from Africa, to be able to share the value of that tradition and how that can impact and support families and going forward in terms of that concept. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for being with us, and we'll see you soon in our next pre-recorded webinar.